All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is Galen Barbos with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm joined here by my colleague, Will Gorman, and we are happy to present to all of you today some of the highlights from a report that we recently put out, evaluating the capabilities of behind-the-meter solar plus storage in providing backup power during long-duration power interruptions. This report involved the contributions from a whole variety of folks listed on the slide here, including a couple colleagues of ours from the National Renewable Energy Lab. And this report is the first in what we plan to be kind of a series of studies over the next couple of years, evaluating different aspects of how distributed solar and storage can be deployed and used to enhance customer reliability and resilience. And so this is sort of our opening salvo in this kind of research program. Before getting started here, we wanted to just give a few quick kind of housekeeping items. So the first is that this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording along with the slides online within the next day or so. I'll put the URL where you can find the recording along with the report itself. I'll put that in the chat window shortly. The other piece of housekeeping item is that we will have some Q&A at the end. And I would just encourage all of you to enter your questions into the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of the screen. I'll be assembling and organizing those questions as we go. And then we'll hopefully have maybe at least 10 or 15 minutes at the end to get through as many of those as we can. So please do enter those questions as you go. So I'm going to start out here, and then we'll be handing the baton over to Will shortly. So Will, if you want to just advance a couple slides. So the presentation and the report is organized as shown here. And really, I think the only thing that I wanted to point out is that the results and analysis are split into these two different sections that we refer to as the synthetic event analysis and the historical event analysis. And will be explaining those in further detail, but essentially the synthetic event analysis involves going through every single county in the US and looking at how these systems would perform under kind of a standardized set of hypothetical power interruptions, whereas the historical event analysis involves looking at a kind of a series of 10 actual historical events. Next slide, please. So just to provide a little bit of context for this study, over the past few years, we've seen pretty notable uptake in paired solar plus storage by both residential and commercial customers. That trend is being driven by a variety of factors, but certainly one of the major ones has been concerns around grid reliability and resilience and customer interest in using these systems for backup power. Despite that kind of growing interest, we hadn't really seen any attempt at systematically evaluating the capabilities of these systems in providing backup power, particularly over long duration events. And so this study was really intended to address that gap. Next slide. So the overall objective of this work, as we indicated, is to evaluate the capabilities of distributed or behind-the-meter solar plus storage and providing backup power to the individual site hosts during long-duration power interruptions. And for the purpose of this report, long duration refers to events of at least 1 day or more. We looked at interruptions up to 10 days, at least within the synthetic event analysis, and longer than that for some of the historical events. There are many aspects to performing such an evaluation. We certainly did not cover every single possible issue, but rather really our goal was to establish sort of a baseline set of performance estimates and to identify what are some of the key drivers for performance of these systems in providing backup power. The analysis is simulation based, and so we're using modeled solar and load profiles and then simulating battery storage dispatch during power interruption events. One of the unique aspects of this work is that the load profiles were disaggregated by end use. And so we were able to look at scenarios where customers are providing backup not only to the whole building, but also to just designated critical loads. And we'll talk more about specifically how we define those critical loads. In terms of the scope, we consider both a set of different residential building types as well as commercial building types. We looked, as I mentioned, at both whole building backup configurations as well as different critical load backup configurations. And really, I think the main thrust of this report was to do this analysis across a really broad range of different conditions related to climate and geography, building stock conditions, and the outage conditions themselves. As I mentioned, this study is the first in what will be a series of reports in this general area. A couple areas that we know we want to follow up on is first to look at how these systems would perform during short duration interruption events. So kind of the more typical power interruptions that we experience that might only last for an hour or two, but may occur more frequently than these longer duration events. And then in addition to that, really kind of digging further into some of the interactions between solar plus storage and other distributed energy resources. So in other words, as buildings become more efficient, more electrified, more flexible, how does that impact the ability of solar plus storage to provide backup power? In addition to those interactions, we also are planning to explore some of the interactions with other competing uses for storage equipment. In many cases, these battery storage units are not just sitting there idle, fully charged, waiting for an outage to happen, but customers are doing other things with those batteries on a day-by-day basis, and that can impact their ability to provide backup power. And so that's another topic that we didn't really look at kind of rigorously in this particular study, but is something that we plan to take up in future work. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Will, who's going to walk us through the study results.
Great. Thank you, Galen, for setting the context for the work. And thank you all for joining and listening to our presentation today. So as Galen mentioned, you're going to be with me for the remainder of the webinar. And if I do my job well, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'll be watching the clock to make sure we get through everything. And do please respond with questions in the Q&A. If we don't get to all of them at the end, we do try to follow up. So really do appreciate engagement in that feature of the Zoom webinar. Okay, so I'm first going to start with just a few slides going into a little bit more detail of our methodological framework for this analysis beyond what Galen already went through. And I'm going to spend a good amount of time here because this is where I'll spend most of the time giving the overview of the methods. I'm not going to go into so much detail in the remainder of the webinar, and do encourage looking at the report that's online to dive into a little bit more of the details. But we just do not have enough time to dive into all of the weeds in this 1-hour webinar. So in terms of the analysis structure, the key pillar of the work is 3 temporally and geospatially aligned data sets. And those data sets are summarized on the left side in those blue boxes of this PowerPoint slide. And those are power interruptions, end-use load profiles, and solar profiles. And so Galen already mentioned this briefly about power interruptions, but basically what we do in order to have a lot of geospatial coverage across the United States is introduce what we call synthetic events. And what we stipulate is a 3-day outage in every United States county in every month of the year to allow us to do some comparability, not just geospatially, but also seasonally. And the way we specify the start day of those outages is we calculate the net load, so the load subtracted from solar across every day, and we specify the median net load as the start day in our base case, and we do some sensitivities around that I'll get to. But these are the synthetic events. But as Galen mentioned, we also look at 10 events that happened over the last 4 to 5 years that were particularly impactful in the United States. And we look at 4 counties for each of those events and ask the question, if a homeowner had installed solar and storage during those events, how would have those systems performed? So those are the power interruptions, and we'll go into more detail once we step through the results. For load profiles, what we're doing is relying on simulations from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's ResStock and ComStock models. And what these models basically do is they come up with distributions of building stock conditions across the United States, and with those building stock conditions create hourly disaggregated load profiles in both the residential and commercial building types, as Galen mentioned. For the majority of this presentation, we're going to focus on single-family detached homes, but we do look at mobile homes, multifamily homes in the residential context, and we spend time with hospitals, schools, and retail buildings in the commercial context. I will spend probably 1 to 2 minutes talking about a few of these other building types, but I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, mainly just to whet y'all's palate and encourage you to go to the report. And again, most of the time here will be spent on single-family homes. And then finally, we take the weather data files that were used to simulate those load shapes and simulate our own solar production profiles using NREL's system advisory model. So that's the key data pillar. And so all of those 3 aligned time series data flow into a pretty simple dispatch model where we are specifying that solar and storage sequentially meet a specified load shape during a power interruption and calculate one output metric, which you'll see throughout the results, which is the percent of critical or total load served during the interruption. Now you see this other box on this slide with the assumptions and scenarios. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on sizing and critical loads with slides, but it's important. I talked a little bit about how we specify the start day for the synthetic events with this median net load. We will do sensitivities around that. We'll do sensitivities around the duration of the power interruptions. Our baseline case, again, is a 3-day interruption, but we'll look at things from 1 to 10 day. And then I won't talk about this today, but we do a sensitivity on the start time of these synthetic events. That's in the main report. The baseline case starts all these outages at midnight. And the initial state of charge, we assume in our baseline case is 100%. Also have sensitivities on this, but again, that's in the main report. I'm not going to be talking about that today. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into how we define critical loads here. So Galen mentioned that one of the advantageous things about ResStock is that they have a lot of disaggregation of end uses. And so you can see all of the different end use categories in the graphic on the right. And we consider 3 different backup configurations. So we have a limited critical load case, which looks at refrigeration, nighttime lighting, well pumps, if a particular home has or relies on a water well, and basic plug loads that we specify manually to represent computer, internet, cell phone charging, a fairly limited set of plug loads. That's our limited critical load case. We also look at a critical load case, which has all of the same limited critical loads, but we add heating and cooling end uses, which are highlighted in red on the slide that you see here. And then finally, we will show some limited results on whole building backup. We basically add in everything that is shaded white on the graphic, but we won't spend too much time talking about whole building backup. All right, and so what do we do on system sizing? So one of the things that we noticed when we were looking at industry reports and looking at academic literature is oftentimes the way that these types of analyses go is they try to optimize and answer the question, what system size do you need in order to meet a certain outage or interruption event? And what we were interested in is looking at, well, empirically, what types of sizes of systems do we observe getting installed, and how would those system sizes perform in a given set of interruptions? So it's a slightly different approach, and what that means is we have to come up with system sizing. So for PV system sizing, what we do is our base case assumes that the solar is sized to generate 100% of the building's annual energy consumption, and then run sensitivities where we drop that 100% to 50%, or we subject the system sizing to some roof area constraints. So that's what we do on PV system sizing, and that's generally the distributions of our results, or our inputs on sizing, align with tracking the sun data set that Galen and a bunch of others lead up at the lab. On storage sizing, we rely on the similar data set on behind the meter solar and storage installations, and we consider both a 10 kilowatt hour battery system and a 30 kilowatt hour battery system, which basically bookend the distribution of batteries getting adopted at the residential level. We do include a sensitivity that will show that we go all the way up to 100 kilowatt hours, which might be representative of a large electric vehicle battery that would be capable of providing home backup. But beyond that sensitivity, it's important to note we don't think too deeply about this electric vehicle scenario, which obviously is an important one to think about, especially if you're reading the news, a lot of people talking about that, but it's really just the sensitivity of battery size that we do to try to think about that type of scenario happening in the future. So finally, this is the last method slide, and then promise we'll get into some results. This is just to give you intuition about what we are doing when I talk about dispatch of our battery. So what you see here is a representative time series where total load is in black, PV production is in orange, and you can see it's a fairly sunny day in this illustrative example, not a lot of cloud coverage. We have unserved load in blue, and then the battery state of charge is on a percentage basis using the axis on the right, and that's in green for a 10 kilowatt hour battery and a 30 kilowatt hour battery. And what we're really doing, you can see this if you look at the leftmost side of the graph, is we say if there's battery available, sequentially meet load until that battery is empty, and if that battery is empty, you start shedding load. And then you can see when PV rises, you start serving more load again, the battery gets filled up, and we go throughout this outage event sequentially, basically doing these calculations. An important thing to note is that solar curtailment does happen here. So you can see, especially in the 10 kilowatt hour battery case, a flat line, battery's at 100% state of charge, the solar's still above load, but there's nowhere for that to go because we are on outage conditions. There's no flow back allowed, and the purpose is totally to provide home use. So important to keep that in mind, that that's flowing through these analyses. All right, so hopefully that gives you at least a little bit of a sense of our methods, our approach, what we're doing here in terms of the analysis. And so now, as Galen mentioned, we're going to have a presentation broken up into the synthetic interruptions and the historical interruptions. So we'll start with synthetic events. And what I first am going to talk about is the scenario analysis, where we have wide geospatial coverage across the United States, focused on county median homes, so typical homes from a building stock standpoint. And we can explore backup performance across a lot of these different sensitivities that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And then the following section we'll look a little bit deeper at the variation in building stock. So for a subset of locations in the United States, look at all building models that the NREL ResStock team can come up with. So important context for these two single family detached homes sections. So all right, so let's start with the median residential single-family detached home results. So the first thing we tried to ask was, how would a relatively small system back up a limited set of critical loads? So these are the no heating and cooling loads included here. And so what you can see here in these graphs, both for winter and summer, is that there's a lot of yellow. A lot of yellow means you're serving 100% or at least a majority of those limited critical loads. You do see a sprinkling of green in these charts. And so there are a few counties, especially in the winter, that have some performance decline. And that's typically in these northern counties, which have greater seasonal variability in solar installation. Another kind of important or interesting aspect here is that the results do change as you lower the PV system size. So as you go from left to right on these graphics, you're going from that 100% annual load PV system sizing to the 50%. In the summer, you see this doesn't really make a difference. There's enough PV production, but in the winter, you see a little bit of performance decline, but still a majority of counties being able to provide almost all of the limited critical loads with the relatively small system. So now what happens when you update those load scenarios, and you're now looking at heating and cooling, as well as home building backup? Obviously, there's not as much yellow in these graphics, and so backup performance is significantly lower in these cases. Across all counties and months, in the critical load scenario, we calculate that 85% of critical load is served on average. But a thing that's going to be important really throughout this presentation is that we are relying on NREL's ResStock and ComStock models and basically take them as given, and don't necessarily look at load flexibility or behavioral adjustments that a homeowner might undertake in the case of an outage event. I will show some sensitivities where we try to tease that apart a little bit with set point analysis, and so we'll get there. But this is definitely one angle of the work that we're looking forward to expanding on, as Galen mentioned, in future years. So in terms of these geographic trends on this map, you see that performance, especially in the critical load case, is lowest in the Southeast and the Pacific Northwest in the winter times. And that's because these are regions of the country where the building stock has electric heating, particularly baseboard electric heating, as common. And then when you go down to the summer months, those geographic trends change, and you're looking at places in the Southwest and the Southeast performing worse, and these are places with large cooling loads. So a key takeaway here is that the heating and cooling regional trends are really important, depending on when that outage interruption will happen for a home. Probably not surprising for most of us here that when we go all the way to whole building backup, so add a bunch more loads on top, performance degrades overall, but a lot of the regional patterns remain the same, suggesting that heating and cooling is really a regional story driving the differences in our analysis. So to dive just a little bit deeper into those conclusions, what I now want to show on this slide is for a subset of those counties, building up the different end uses. So you see that on the x-axis of these slides, building up these different end uses that we study, and the corresponding amount of served and unserved load, to try to at least explain some of the results that were fairly aggregated before. And so what you see is the first four loads, so fridge, light, plug, well, these are our limited critical loads cases. These are relatively small and thus pretty easy to back up. And these examples of cities, they all are able to serve this limited critical load case. And it's not until you add cooling and heating and you look at regions in which cooling and heating are important electric loads, where you start to see some of that unserved energy. And so also in these graphs, you can see the heating and cooling technology that's assumed in the region. And so you'll maybe be interested to see, Chicago and Boston, you would think those have significant heating loads, but these assume fossil furnace-based systems, which is typical for those regions, which is why they're included here. And you only have a little bit of unserved energy because of the demand from electric furnace fans. But most of the heating is being done by fossil loads. So the last point to mention here is that we find that cooling and heating loads are difficult to serve, but again, a reminder that our analysis is on an hourly basis. And so it's possible, really likely, that we might even be overstating the capabilities of the system to provide this service, given that, especially on the heating side of things, sometimes the power demand can be quite high as compared to the system sizes that we've specified. But since we're looking at an hourly basis, that gets a little bit aggregated. We did do a 15-minute analysis where we looked a little bit more granular to see if that power constraint binded a little bit more. And we did find that it did bind, but it didn't change our aggregate results, because ultimately the energy balance across these systems lead to the results on an aggregate basis. But it's important to keep in mind of some of these power dynamics. The last thing I'll mention is that this is looking at a lot of electric baseboard heating. But it's important that heat pump technologies, which a lot of people are talking about, were not assessed on this slide. We do look at them a little bit in future slides, and I'll talk to them. The high-level conclusion is that heat pumps do better than this electric baseboard heating story, but we are a little bit limited with current building stock conditions in this analysis to say a whole lot about heat pumps, but it's something that we want to look into the future. All right, so moving along, I mentioned a sensitivity on battery size. Everything that we had been looking at before this was a 10 kilowatt hour battery. But we wanted to answer the question, what size or how does this critical load served vary as you increase that battery size? And so that's what you see in this graphic. On the x-axis is the battery size increasing all the way to 100 kilowatt hours. This black dotted line is the population weighted average across all counties. And then we provide percentile bands of the 95th and 5th percentile county. And so you can see that at the upper end of sizes that we observe in the market, which are these 30 kilowatt hour systems, there is a significant improvement in backup performance as compared to 10 kilowatt hours. So we go from that 85% of critical load served all the way to 96% between these counties, but there is still a range of 76% to 100%, depending on what county you're looking at. And you can see that geospatial pattern on this bottom map, which is the critical load with heating and cooling case. You see basically the same geospatial pattern, but obviously with more load being served because of the bigger battery. We do find that there are diminishing returns as larger batteries are still constrained by the amount of PV production that is produced. This is holding that PV size constant. And you can see that this matters in some substantial amount for counties at the lower percentile range, whereas the upper percentile counties kind of reach serving that critical load and then remain flat, obviously, throughout these results. So the remainder of the analysis is going to focus on single-family homes with 30 kilowatt hours of storage and with critical load, including heating and cooling, given that this is the most likely backup use case that we were interested in, people sizing their system a little bit bigger to provide backup and caring about heating and cooling. So just keep that in mind as we look through the next slides. That is now the new baseline case. Okay, so the next thing I want to share is the sensitivity of these results to the outage duration. So again, as a reminder, this was the base scenario that we've been looking at in the past few slides was a 3-day outage, and the battery started with 100% state of charge. What we now do is vary that outage from 1 to 10 days, and found some pretty interesting results, or at least weren't necessarily intuitive to us before we ran this, which is that backup performance does decline with outage duration, but the effects were generally modest. And so the reason it declines is because the stored energy in the battery is depleted at the beginning of the event, and then at the end of a long event is really limited by the daily PV production. And then the longer the duration goes on, the increased likelihood of an especially low solar or high load day, which those things all together can reduce the performance of these systems. But again, these things were relatively modest, even as you expand it out to 10 days of outage. Now, what was potentially, or what was a more important result, or what our findings were more sensitive to, was the insensitivity to the outage start day within each month. And so I mentioned earlier that the way we specify our base case is we calculate the net load for every day in the year, and within each month, we select the median net load. So kind of an average load day and an average solar day. But we can look at a worst and best case scenario where we actually specify the highest net load day, which would be the best case, or the worst case scenario, and then the lowest net load day, which would be the best case scenario, where there's a lot of solar relative to load. And what you see in this graphic here is, again, for winter and summer outage months, and then across electric heating and no electric heating, and electric cooling and no electric cooling, how our performance varies based on whether it's the worst to the best start day. And you can see it can be quite sensitive, especially on that electric heating side of things, where across these county median homes, performance in winter months drops to 53% on the worst days compared to 96% on the best days. You see similar types of effects with air conditioning and hot climates, which would be kind of the lower band. So there is a range here, but in general, it is not as sensitive as the heating story. Now, it's important to be very clear here that this analysis, the synthetic event analysis, relies on typical meteorological year weather data. And so while there is obviously variation within a month within this typical meteorological year data, greater variations could obviously occur in any specific year given an extreme weather event. And that is not something that we look at here. So even these best and worst case scenarios are not necessarily exploring the full range of what's likely, but it definitely gives some indication of the importance of weather variability and the performance of these systems. Okay, so that was the conclusion of the scenario analysis, again, where we were looking at the typical buildings. I'm now going to jump into variation across building stock. And this was an important aspect of the analysis because it allowed us to dive into things like energy efficiency, temperature set point, other behavioral parameters that the residential modeling by NREL can integrate, but it wasn't something that we had variation on when looking across all counties. Okay, so first, just to situate us a little bit, so you can get a sense of what we're doing here, we're looking at 6 counties, high population counties, that we've shown the main city in those counties here. So Seattle, Chicago, LA, Houston, Phoenix, and Boston. And you see a distribution in these graphs, and these distributions represent the number of building models that come out of res stock and the corresponding critical load served in our baseline case, so 30 kilowatt hour battery, 3-day outage event, critical load with heating and cooling. And in the blue dashed line, this is the median building. So these are the results that we had been looking at in the previous slides. So this is where they fall when looking at a distribution of results across these counties. And so you can see there is variation, but most of the variation, at least with these particular cities that we chose, were in Houston and Phoenix. And there's less variation in others, partly because we're assuming a large battery here, and these regions have less cooling load and or a lower penetration of electric space heating. So that drives some of the results here. And so because of that, because we're really interested in unpacking variation in performance, the next few slides are going to focus exclusively on Houston and Phoenix. So keep that in mind. All right, so the first thing to look at, it really provides intuition about really even the remainder in few slides, is that there is a general relationship that we found which makes intuitive sense for the amount of critical load demanded during these interruption events and the critical load that you can ultimately serve. And so on the x-axis here, you see the critical load demanding during the winter month outages. And on the y-axis, you see the critical load served. And it's a pretty clear trend that as you go and want to serve more critical load, it's harder to do so. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the PV system size here is scaling with load. So PV sizes are getting bigger as you move from left to right on this axis, but the battery size is fixed at 30 kilowatt hours. And those higher usage customers are going to see more PV curtailment because of these battery constraints. And now the scatter across these trend lines reflect differences in customer load shapes and daily variation in critical load amounts, among a suite of other factors. We don't focus on that too much in the report. Rather, what we focus on are differences that are driving, differences in building stock that are driving the demand for summer or winter critical load. And so that's things like home square footage, heating and cooling equipment types, efficiency, and some occupant behavioral factors. So we'll jump into those a little bit here, where we have first looking at the impact of energy efficiency. On the top, we can compare the air leakage rate, so how leaky your home is. So after heating your home, if a lot of that heat escapes, that would be a higher leakage rate. So moving to the right on this x-axis, and you can see that that leakage also is correlated with lower backup performance. We find that for the leakiest of homes, performance is about 20% lower. Obviously, this is in Houston and Phoenix, not the most cold places in the United States. So these would probably be more pronounced in cold climates. A similar story on the air conditioning side in summer. As you get a more efficient central air conditioner, backup performance can improve from 10 to 20% relative to homes with lower efficiency units. And then lastly, impact of heating and cooling set points. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that our focus wasn't so much on load flexibility and behavioral parameters. Those are in general quite hard to model, but ResStock does provide distributions of set points here, and it gives us the ability to compare different choices of set points and how that affects the load served. And so what we see here on the heating side, average heating set point is 70 degrees. In Phoenix, the vast majority of homes are served at that level. In Houston, it's a little different. Vast majority of homes are served at 60 degrees. And you do see performance generally decline as the hotter you want your home, the harder it is for that system to serve load. Similar story on the cooling set points, though it's in the reverse. The colder you want your home in a summer outage, the harder it is for systems to serve. But we did find these trends in our results, suggesting that the acceptance of less heating or cooling service will be an important parameter when trying to back up homes with solar and storage. All right, so I have a limited set of time left, so about 9 minutes. So I'm gonna quickly jump through this mobile homes and commercial building sections, as I said at the beginning, really just to introduce you to the work. Do encourage follow-up questions or questions in the Q&A or going into the report to dive deeper here, because this is gonna feel like a quick whirlwind. Okay, so with mobile homes, what you see is pretty similar stories with single-family homes. And it's one of the reasons why we're not going to spend much time here. Similar geographic patterns, similar overall performance when comparing mobile to single-family homes. And the only thing I guess I will mention here is that we didn't think a lot about how smaller system sizes might be more applicable to certain building types. Either due to financial constraints of the people living in those types of homes, but also some physical constraints if the mobile home roof cannot bear the same type of weight. So there's some of these parameters that weren't central to our analysis. We were really focused on fundamental solar production and then the corresponding load shapes that came out of the residential model. But that's a quick intro to what we looked at with mobile homes. Commercial homes require a little bit more unpacking because there are some methodological differences. The commercial load profiles are not as disaggregated. So we could not look at critical load scenarios. We could only look at whole building backup. And then a key point to stress here is, and this matters a little bit in the residential case too, and I talked about this, about we're not looking at behavioral factors, but arguably it's even more important in the commercial space. And we have to, because of the load shapes, look at normal operating conditions, not thinking about these buildings as an emergency shelter or operating in some kind of critical emergency condition. PV system sizing assumptions are basically the same. We look at 100% annual consumption, but then we also look in more detail at roof area constraints. And you'll see how that matters a little bit more on the next slide. And storage sizing, on the other hand, is different. So again, we're trying to rely on empirical data. So current commercial systems are generally installed to accept 30% of the average daily solar production at a given location. So the megawatt hours of our battery are set at the average daily solar production multiplied by 30%. But we consider two other configurations where we size the system based on the residual load, basically the net load over the average of 1 day and the average of 3 days. So these are substantially bigger battery sizes than the typical commercial installation. So again, I'm gonna have to run through this pretty quickly. I wanna get to the historical results. One of the big findings is that in hospitals in particular, the roof constraint was particularly binding. So you see that lower performance, especially on what you have on the x-axis is the battery sizing scenario. Hospitals are generally more likely to be multi-story, which constrains the system a lot more as compared to a retail or a school building. But when we take away that roof constraint, you see that the different commercial buildings roughly have similar performance. And partly, again, that's because we're sizing that PV system to the annual load of the building. It is interesting to note that that 100% sizing does not really constrain, or the retail and school buildings are not really constrained by the roofs, at least as we see the roof sizes in the Comstock NREL modeling. All right, so there's a lot more to unpack there. There is more info in the results online, but I do want to keep things moving so we have time for Q&A. So in the last 5 minutes, I will go through the historical event analysis. So What we really were trying to do here is answer the question, how would these systems performed providing backup during specific historical events? And we think this is really nice complement to the synthetic results that I have been talking about at the beginning or for a majority of this presentation, because one, it better captures the correlation between weather, which impacts PV production and load, and the occurrence of outages. And it also can showcase concrete examples of resilience capabilities. So how do we specify these interruption profiles? We get outage data from poweroutage.us to identify start and end times at the county level. And then we mentioned that we're looking at 4 affected counties. We also, just to quickly make sure we're on the same page here, we basically are using a lot of the same assumptions with the synthetic events. So we use NREL generated end-use load profiles, but we use weather data instead of being typical meteorological year. We use actual meteorological year data during those events, but the PV system sizing assumptions are the same, and the critical load with heating and cooling assumptions are the same. Again, I'm going to focus on residential single-family detached homes in this analysis. We do look at commercial results, but again, those are going to be in the main body of the report. So what events are we looking at? So there's 10 events that we dive into. 5 hurricane events, so Hurricane Harvey, Irma, Florence, Michael, and Isaias. You can see the states that these happened in, the counties, perhaps not that important to recognize, but we do have a list of counties here. And then an important thing to keep in mind as you look at these results is that the duration of the events were all distinct. Whereas in the synthetic events, we specified the same duration for everybody. Obviously, the historical events are empirical, so they have different duration, and that can affect the results. But we tried to have a mix of hurricanes, thunderstorms, and winter storm analyses here. So what we find, so on the x-axis are all of the different events. These box plots are basically distributions of all of single-family detached homes that NREL modeled for us. So we had a distribution based on the building stocks in each of these locations. And we found that the 30 kilowatt-hour system, battery system with solar, could meet critical load for all modeled homes in the thunderstorm event in Texas, the PVESS events in California, the derecho event in Iowa, and Hurricane Michael. But performance does vary, in particular for some of these hurricane events, based on solar insolation differences, which I'll get into on the next slide. For the 2 winter storm events, we found that the median home could actually be served. So the thick line here represents the median. But a sizable fraction of customers in these locations have baseboard heating, electric heating, and so those had lower performances during the winter storm events. We didn't actually find much differences across our county types, and so don't really talk too much about them in our results. And so just real quickly, I mentioned this variability of weather insolation. Hurricane Florence was our worst performing event. And what you can see here is that even though the outage start is probably very correlated with peak wind performance of that hurricane, the cloudy insolation levels stayed and did not recharge the battery, and that led to a decent amount of unserved load at the beginning of the event. Hurricane Harvey also had lower insolation levels at the beginning, but given the longer duration, on average was able to serve more load. And then with Hurricane Irma, you see it had 1 day of low insolation. It does deplete the battery, but quickly soon thereafter, the skies cleared up and you could see load being served. And so that's why it could really serve most of the load of the event. So it's another important weather variability story driving the results. Okay, so there's 10 minutes left. I don't think I'm going to walk through these key takeaways. I think I'll leave them up as we get into Q&A for you guys to read them if you like. but they provide the high-level points that we talked about today, both on the residential side and on the commercial side. But I think with that, maybe I'll ask Galen to come back off of mute, and presumably has a smattering of questions that we can now get to. And thanks so much for everyone's attention.
Great, thanks, Will. Yes, we do have quite a few questions here. So I'll have to be somewhat selective in which ones we go through. And I will just note that if you asked a question that we don't get a chance to answer, feel free to shoot us an email. Some of the questions that we got are sort of more methodological in nature, and you may be able to find an answer if you look at the full report. But again, feel free to shoot us an email if you don't find an answer to that question. In terms of those that we will get through, I think I'll start with one, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. But we have a question asking about how heat pump systems would, or how buildings with electric heat pumps would perform compared to those with electric resistance heating. And that's a topic that we actually did sort of dig into a little bit further. And so I thought, Will, maybe if you wanted to just jump to that slide in the appendix, that could be a useful way of answering the question.
Yeah, no, for sure. So yeah, we did look at this a little bit. There's important considerations both on the fact that heat pumps are more efficient, they use less energy, but they also, in general, require a smaller power draw. So there's both this energy component that you want to think about, and then the power component. As I said, we're limited a little bit by the building stock, but what we can see is that performance in places that had at least a substantial number of heat pumps does significantly improve as you move from electric resistance to a heat pump option. Now, it doesn't go all the way up, to the performance of the fossil system, but it's important to keep in mind, and I stress this throughout, is that we're not necessarily looking at the most efficient heat pumps. This is the building stock as it exists today. And so some of our future work really wants to dive into this a little bit more detailed. And then again, we're not looking at how behavioral set points might affect some of these results. And so with all of that, we would expect these heat pump results to look even better, but in general, they perform, they're easier to back up for sure as compared to electric baseboard.
Thanks, Will. We also got a couple questions related to whether or not we looked at backup performance for LMI, or low and moderate income households, and kind of how our analysis generally addresses that segment of the customer population. I can take a crack at answering that, Will, just to give you a little bit of a break. So, we'll quickly kind of breeze through some of the work that we did looking at the performance of these systems on mobile homes. We also ran some analysis looking at the performance of these systems in multifamily, for multifamily homes. And so that was one aspect of the work where we at least tried to sort of tailor the selection of building types to ones that might be more relevant to the LMI community. And then in addition, within the historical event analysis, you saw that for each of those events, we selected sort of a sample of counties affected by each event. And we selected those counties based on a number of different criteria, but for each event, we did try to include at least one county with a high social vulnerability index. So this is an index that FEMA uses, and it accounts for a variety of different kind of characteristics. But one of those key characteristics is kind of income levels and vulnerability within each county. So those were the kind of the two main ways that we sought to address kind of the LMI households and communities. But I think as we go forward, we're going to continue to be looking for ways of making sure that this work is applicable to those households as well. So we'll let's see. I'm really just quickly kind of looking through the large set of questions we've gotten here. We had a couple questions about just the sort of modeling tool that we used for the storage dispatch. Can you explain a little bit more about that tool?
Yeah, for sure. So we developed a pretty simple algorithm in-house. So I was using the R programming language. And the tool is really just set up to sequentially look at the state of charge in your battery in a given hour, the solar production in a given hour, and the load demanded in that hour. And it employs some power constraints. So we make sure that the power capability of that system can actually meet the power demand. And then if it can, we reduce the state of charge of the battery as needed. So yeah, so that's the tool. That's how we implemented it. There's nothing necessarily publicly available, unfortunately, to use that tool, but there are tools similar to this that are publicly available, like NREL's REOPT model. But at this point, what we used in our particular setting isn't available.
We had a couple questions about costs. Is that something that we considered in the analysis?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a super important question. Obviously, what I've talked about today is a technical type of analysis, technical potential type of analysis, and therefore we did not look at costs. These systems obviously are costly, even though the costs have come down. In the next few years of our work, we're going to work more systematically on integrating those costs, comparing them, doing some type of value of lost load or resiliency type value analysis, but we didn't do that here, and so you won't find that in the main body of the report. But it's a good reason to stay tuned to our future emails. This is something we'll unpack better in the future.
Right. Yeah, and kind of along those lines, another. This is really just, I think, a comment, which is an important one to note, and something that we had thought about a little bit is whether we might want to consider scenarios where, particularly during extreme weather events, rather than heating an entire home, instead a customer might just run a portable space heater in a single room. And that's something that we did not look at here. We considered it and didn't really sort of have the modeling capabilities immediately on hand to do that. But this is another kind of scenario that we had identified as being something that we would like to look at in the future. So thank you for that comment. Let's see, on so another question is whether we considered looking at the cooling effect of solar panels shading homes. In other words, if you have a PV system on your rooftop, that provides some benefit in terms of reducing the solar heat gain of the home and reducing the cooling demand. That's not something we looked at, but is yet another great example of how we'd like to kind of refine the analysis in the future. So we've got 1 minute here. So one last question. Have you evaluated the energy arbitrage opportunity? In other words, filling up batteries at low wholesale market prices and then discharging them when prices are high. That's not something that we looked at here. That is definitely in scope for our future work. For the purpose of this study, where we were focused on long duration outages, we, at least in our base case, just assumed that customers had some ability to anticipate the outage and were able to fully charge their batteries up. When we turn our attention in the next year to looking at shorter duration events, that assumption is no longer going to hold. Those typical short duration events happen without much advance warning. And so we're going to assume that customers are using their batteries for other purposes, whether that's participating in wholesale power markets, responding to retail rate pricing signals, participating in demand response programs. There are a variety of things that customers can be sort of doing with their battery systems on a day-to-day basis that's going to impact the state of charge of those systems when then interruption hits. And so that's not something we considered here, but is absolutely at the kind of the top of our list for things that we want to incorporate into future iterations of this work. So with that, we're at the top of the hour, and I'll just thank all of you again for attending. For those whose questions we didn't get a chance to answer, I apologize, but please do feel free to follow up with us. Our email addresses are listed on the slide here, so feel free to shoot us an email. Also listed on the slide here is the URL where you can access all of our group's publications, in addition to this report. So feel free to check that out. And of course, feel free to sign up for our email list. We promise not to spam you, but that is the way that we communicate to the outside world whenever we release a new report. So with that, thanks again. And until next time, take care.
Thanks, everyone.